like to start off by asking about your novel's relation to the key Victorian texts, and these were Jane Eyre, David Copperfield, and Villette. All three of those chronologically organised first-person narrators, fictional autobiographies, novels in which the person who tells the story is the novel's central concern. And then our outlier, Wuthering Heights, a story told famously by two narrators, Lockwood and Nellie, both of whom, in very different ways, exist at a distance from the story that has the most power, the most passion in the novel, the story we remember, the love story of Cathy Earnshaw and Heathcliff. And I, of course, am really committed to seeing Notes on a Scandal as a Wuthering Heights novel. The only access we have to the story of Sheba and Connolly necessarily comes through Barbara, someone who is not at the centre of that story. And I wonder if you can talk to us a bit. I mean, you can completely reject the Wuthering Heights analogy or genealogy if you wish, but can you talk to us a little bit about that choice of, yes, it's a first-person narration, but not to have Barbara Covert be the central figure of the story that is told, the story of the scandal?
My apologies to the undergraduates I spoke to earlier, because some of this is necessarily going to be a bit repetitive. What I told them a little earlier was that I began this novel thinking I was going to write it in the third person, and that it was going to be a novel about a woman's obsessive love for a younger man, a young boy, a pupil of hers. And at a certain point, and I can't, it's too long ago to remember exactly how this came about, but I hit on the idea of having a third party observe the events and describe them. And when I came up with the character of Barbara, it was a rare time in my life when a character actually took over a little. In general, I always listen to other authors enviously when they talk about their characters dictating what happens next and leaping up off the page and sitting on the desk. And I'm always comforted by that Nabokov quote. He was asked, do your characters do this? And he said, no, my characters are all galley slaves. Generally, mine are also. But in this instance, the character of Barbara was so, she sort of appeared fully formed, and partly just because I enjoyed writing her so much. She says early on in the book, this is not a story about me. In a sense, it is a story about her. So I suppose what I like about her as observer is I like having this person whose face is pressed up against the window. Her name is Covet, and she is a great coveter of what other people have, particularly what the other woman in the novel, Sheba, has. I suppose I'd never written an unreliable narrator before, and I enjoyed everything that gave me to play with. Is that?
Well, that's. I mean, that is very useful for me to realise that's where the Wuthering Heights analogy breaks down, really, because we can try and care a little bit about Lockwood, and we can see that Nellie has certain partisanships and so forth, but there is no. Although I think the similarities to me are that we have to work to understand what the relationship between the two lovers is in both cases. But certainly Emily Bronte is not, I think, wanting us to construct a parallel significance for her two narrators. So that would be the place where... but I wonder, at the risk of sort of flogging my poor Victorian horse here, but one of the sentences that I quoted to you when we met was a sentence I had written on the board for my students when we started talking about the novel. And it comes pretty early. It's on page 12, and it's Barbara describing the archaeology of the school, well, the history of the school in which she is a history teacher and at which Sheba Hart has recently come to teach pottery. And here's the sentence. In addition to its 3 modern structures, the gym, the arts centre and the science block, the St George's site includes 2 rather decrepit red brick buildings, Old Hall and Middle Hall, which date back to the school's original Victorian incarnation as an orphanage. Now,
At which point you died and went to heaven.
I was so happy, of course, and I thought, here is a sign that Zoë Heller has planted this little clue for us here in order for us to understand the literary descent of her novel. I mean, one of the things, we're both British people, we know these kind of school buildings that we're talking about that have that 19th century original nucleus and have had these agglomerations over the years. But this was how I presented the point to Zoe, trying to convince her that I was right. Those schools very rarely have an orphanage at their centre. They have a national school or a board school, or one of the early elementary schools that set up in the second half of the 19th century. An orphanage is a very particular kind of institution, of course, one that we think of very much in relation to the Victorians, but it is I would say, a very uncommon way, if we're being on the level of plausible realism, that would be a hard structure to find in North London. And so when I saw this word orphanage, I thought, we are talking about the quintessential figure of the Victorian novel here, the Jane Eyre figure, the Pip, the orphan self that is the kind of the place of Victorian first-person narrative. But when I put this to you,
I just liked the idea of it having been originally an orphanage, but I was not thinking of the orphan self from Victorian novels. But what I want to ask you now is, what did you think, if it had been that, what was it there to do? It was to alert the audience to?
That we were meant to connect this to a history of a certain kind of literary formation. I mean, you don't call a school St George's without it doing some kind of English national work. So, and that is a very common structure in Victorian novels too, the idea that these different institutions in little represent the larger national history. So I thought, yes, I know where to go with this. But when I asked you about the orphanage thing before, you said, I liked the idea of those poor little kids wandering down corridors, which, is such a literary idea. So so you said I wanted the Victorian institutional feel.
She wouldn't let it lie.
I wouldn't let it go. But to me, the Victorian institution is as much the novel as any kind of social or, building structure. So I think I can...
Perhaps I was unconsciously invoking the Victorian structure of the self.
Let me go to my second piece of evidence. One of my favourite parts of the novel, and we've talked a fair bit about this, that in Barbara Covert we have a very disturbing narrator, someone whose views and behaviour we really don't want to identify with a lot of the time, and yet every now and again Barbara will come out with opinions, reasoned arguments that are absolutely compelling, the kind of arguments that I think any, right-thinking, educated, aware person would have. And there are these moments where, although we wish to distance ourselves from Barbara, we find a kind of secret sharing that we do actually coalesce with her. And one of the places that I think is very interesting is when she is talking about the difficult politics of what it means when an older woman is having sex with a young man, a boy under the age of consent, the fact that by our socially agreed codes, this is an offense, this is outrageous, this is punishable by law. You have a wonderful reasoned exposition in which Barbara explains, this is one of the things she says, for various reasons our society has chosen to classify people under the age of 16 as children. But then she goes on to explain, why that is a necessary social legal structure, and yet talks about the fact that can we really say in this case that all the power was on Sheba's side? Is Connolly necessarily a victim? To me, I was very interested in the fact that what you're invoking here is age of consent legislation,
right.
And this again is a Victorian formation up to the year of 1885. The age of consent had been 13. So once again, we have something lodging itself in this fairly recent but definitely 19th century history. Again, wondered if the Victorian nature of many of our legal codes, our received opinions, whether that was part of what you were working with here?
No. I mean, a little bit, yes. The thing is, I'm very grateful for some of those inherited Victorian codes and so on. As I'm the mother of a 14-year-old. I'm very keen. There's the age of consent has been raised since 19th century. I think what I wasn't. I mean, surely in most contemporary novels, we will find traces, because we are the Victorians are our very near relatives. I mean, they're not so much our cousins; they're our siblings, right? I mean, and their inheritance is everywhere in our social structures and our family lives and so on and so forth. We're still, in many ways, reacting to the Victorian age.
So this is just an inevitable part of...
I think a little bit.
Mm-hmm. No, and I mean, it makes perfect sense that I, as a Victorianist, would be leaping to those places that ring certain... But, well, I wonder if we could talk more about your decision. We've talked a little bit about how Barbara becomes... is not just clearly just not just a transparent narrator here, and that her story is, as much part of this novel as Sheba and Connolly's story. But talking about your decision to focus on an illicit love affair, why that, what the inspiration for that was, what kind of places?
Oh, well, the literal inspiration was a woman called Mary Kay Letourneau. One of the students reminded me of her name earlier today, who sometime in, I guess, beginning of the 2000s, she was a woman from the Pacific Northwest who was found having an affair with a 14-year-old, I think. She went on to have a child with him, and she went to jail briefly, but he waited for her rather sweetly. And I believe they are still married. Anyway, one of the crucial facts was that the boy was the same age as one of her own sons. And she was his art teacher. And so there was a great huzzarai about that at the time in the press. And there was also a lot of conversation about what it meant for a woman to be a sexual predator, to commit a sexual crime of this nature, and whether it meant the same thing as a man doing it. And I was telling the students earlier that I was present or took part in various arguments in which women were expressing sort of sympathetic feelings towards Mary Kay Letourneau, and men got very upset and said that, this was a perfect example of the double standard, and that a man would be sort of run out of town and all the rest of it. We would be reviled for having even ostensibly consensual relations with a girl below the age of consent, but somehow this wasn't the same for women, and this was ridiculous. So I thought all of that was at the very least interesting, and that was what got me going on it. And I think I established fairly on that I wasn't as interested as I thought I was in the idea of a woman's obsessive love with a much younger man, or that I didn't have very much to say about it, possibly because, it wasn't, I don't know, I wasn't able to imagine myself into that well enough. But when I hit upon Barbara, one of the things she did was sort of amplify the theme of the ways of love being as crooked as a corkscrew by being another person who was also obsessively in love with the wrong person. So I think that's how it came about. I mean, I sort of feel the book is really Barbara's book. And I'm always sort of slightly taken aback when people ask very detailed questions about the nature of the boy-woman love affair, because I sort of feel like, I've forgotten about that. It was always all about Barbara for me.
Although it wasn't to start with, Barbara came, but I did want to read, I think, one of my favourite sentences from the novel. According to evolutionary science, an affair like Sheba's is nothing more than a freakish lay-by on the grand motorway of human survival, which I think is a real cracker of a sentence. But I wondered if we could talk about, without, this is going to sound very pretentious, but if we talked about what your manifesto for fiction is it to go to the freakish lay-by? Is it, we have, clearly legal codes describe normative, generalized situations in which, we will agree to act as if. Are you, by going to the freakish lay-by, saying this is the place that exists, yes, we must travel as a society down the grand motorway, but we need to be aware that these exceptional cases exist, that this is something that the novelist can do, that only the novelist can do, or only the creative writer can do, the creative person, that it is a necessary corrective to the grand narratives, the grand schema. Here you present it in relation to evolutionary science, but I wonder if is this for you both the ethical purpose of fiction, that you can go to the places that exist to trouble our consensus opinions that we hold as a society?
I think it's probably a bit grand to describe it in ethical terms, because usually I think as a writer I'm much more cynical, and in it for me I'm just trying to find something that is juicy and is what I can write about, and what gets me running to the desk rather than slouching forlornly. I definitely think, yes, I think the purpose of fiction is to, it's, whatever David Foster Wallace said about it's the closest thing we get to sort of true communion with one another. It is the great vehicle of empathy. This book in particular, if there is a sort of, it didn't actually get written this way. I didn't sit down with a sort of set of issues I wanted to thrash out in it. But by the end of it, it had become a book about the things that we exclude, precisely about normative values and about Barbara has at the beginning of this book a great rant against newspaper journalism, and in particular tabloid journalism, and the way in which they report sort of anything relating to human sexuality, and in particular anything that sort of seems to fall outside the sort of magic circle of sexual orthodoxy. I mean, you talk about freakish laybys. We have to understand that until very recently, homosexuality was regarded as a freakish layby on the great motorway of human survival. So I think there's actually quite a lot of certainly anyway, reading it for the first time in a long time this weekend, I recognized a lot of my irritation or even anger at a particular kind of the combination of prurience and Puritanism that exists in a lot of certainly British journalism. By the way, you hearing all this? I keep on forgetting to talk into the mic, even though I have a very helpful little note telling me to. Are you hearing me well enough? I will. Okay. So.
Well, I think one of the, and we will hear from students later on, but I think one of the things they really enjoyed about the novel was the relentless way in which you upset any attempt to create nice, tidy categories. It doesn't, unlike the film, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but unlike the film, we cannot make clear divisions between, heterosexual and homosexual here. The movie really decides, there is a moment where poor Judi Dench throws up in a restroom at the school, and in case we hadn't noticed, there's graffiti on the wall that says Barbara Cover is a leser. This is it very clearly casts her as a lesbian villain. The novel, I think, doesn't allow us to do any kind of clear separation. Also, and I think the students found this quite challenging, does not allow a clear line between maternal love and erotic love, does not allow us to have maturity and immaturity in two tidy places. So this is a novel, I think, that likes to upset any binary that we usually use to organize and create clarity for ourselves. Is that was that a conscious strategy, or was that just a necessary part in trying to depict complicated, interesting, contradictory people?
Yeah, it certainly wasn't a conscious strategy. I'm sort of, as you say, I'm thinking, great, just do those things. I love that. I'm so proud. So I think it agrees with something I think my general outlook on things, that I don't really, I'm not very invested in those oppositions, the ones you mentioned.
Well, to talk a bit about the maternal erotic one, which...
Yeah, that one maybe, I feel like...
Well, can I ask you just to talk a little bit about the very disturbing sculpture that Sheba creates at the end? And I think it's indicative that the movie has nothing to do with this. And I think we read out those passages in class. We were all quite troubled, weren't we?
I was troubled by that.
Can you?
I haven't got one of those sitting at home or anything.
Can you talk a little bit about what this sculpture is? Or I could read it out.
Yeah, I'd rather you did. But anyway, Sheba is an artist and a potter, and she has created in this strange period of time when she's living with mad old Barbara and waiting for her case to come before the Crown Court. She has created a statue of herself and the boy she's been having an affair with. And it's a sort of eroticized mother and child with her as Virgin Mary and Connolly, the boy, sort of draped across her lap, right?
And it's But it is both mother and son and two lovers at the same time,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah.
So this, I would say that you are troubling the maternal erotic
Yes.
line there.
Yes. And, she a little bit, and this I did borrow from Mary Kay Letourneau, even though the son is not, she has a son, a special needs son who has Down syndrome at home. I suppose, I mean, I was just thinking about, again, going back, I was talking earlier to the undergraduates about Nigella Lawson, who's in all the English papers at the moment, and in some of them here, because part of what's going on there is Nigella Lawson, who sort of does an ironic take on 50s femininity and motherhood and so on.
How to be a domestic goddess. Yeah.
Right, but is nonetheless being, that's sort of, the ironic bit sometimes gets lost along the way, and she's regarded as a sort of avatar of female wonderfulness, is now being discovered doing all sorts of ungoddess-like things like coke and so on. And I suppose the thing about, I'm not at all keen on that sculpture, but I am interested, as I guess lots of us are, and almost all of us are once we become mothers, in troubling the still quite narrow notion of what constitutes a decent mother. And what is compatible with being the sort of mother that, gets written up nicely in the papers. The public version of motherhood is still amazingly constricting.
Given that we've come so close to the ending of the novel, I'm now going to step into a place which was perhaps the greatest surprise of our earlier conversation. Would you mind reading a bit at the end? So we can just sort of get people up to speed by saying that Barbara has just smashed this troubling sculpture, and then and she comes back into the room where Sheba is. So if you wouldn't mind reading from somewhere.
Somewhere far across London, thunder began to growl. I gathered up as many of the smashed pieces as I could, wrapped them in the newspaper, and took them inside just as it began to rain. Sheba had come downstairs now. She was standing in the kitchen. "Is there anything else I should know about?" I asked her. She shook her head. "Are you sure?" She was silent. I stuffed the newspaper in the bin, and then I ran back upstairs to her room. She must have had an idea of what was going on, because she gave no sign of surprise when I returned with her handbag. She watched me intently as I fished the photographs out from the bottom. When I fetched the kitchen scissors, she did begin to cry a little, but even then it was more in resignation than in protest. After the photographs were cut up, I went to her and took her very gently in my arms. Sheba's body is so slender these days, one feels one could almost crush it. "Come on," I said, "it's all right." She began to cry more energetically, great shuddering sobs. But I kept holding her and speaking softly, and presently she quietened down. "What's going to become of me?" she asked again. "What's going to become of me?" "You're going to be all right, darling," I said, stroking her hair. "Barbara's here." I felt her droop as if in surrender. We stood in the kitchen, rocking very slightly back and forth for a long while. Then I sat her down and made her some lunch, fried eggs and bacon, mugs of strong tea, cosy food for a grey day. She must have been starving, because she gobbled it all up like a navvy and then demanded seconds. Darling girl. Darling, darling Sheba. I made her take a nap after lunch, and when she got up half an hour ago, she was in much better shape. The rain had stopped by then, and she wanted to go for a walk. I let her go alone. I dare say she'll be all right by herself. She seems quite steady and calm after her rest. And she knows by now not to go too far without me.
Now, when I first wrote to Zoe, I said, part of my email, I said, one of the things I love about the novel is I think it has one of the best reasons for a novel ending that I know of. I believed on my first reading, my second reading, my third reading, that Sheba walks out of that house and kills herself we've just seen this sculpture she created smashed to smithereens. She's just had the pictures of herself and Stephen cut up with scissors in front of her. All the rest of her life is in ruins. She is got the court case coming down the line. I could only understand Sheba as walking off, in my imagination, to Hampstead Heath, drowning herself. The reason the text ends is what can be written after this. The other way of looking at it, had she come back, Barbara would have written another chapter. Barbara, at this point, has Sheba exactly where she wants. She is loving feeding her, mugs of strong tea and eggs and bacon. The story would continue, I thought, if Sheba were still in Barbara's grip. The only reason for this novel to end is that something so terrible happens that nothing can be said after it. This was a theory I zealously propagated in my classroom. I brought most of you round, didn't I? There were a few people holding out there, but this is a novel that is intensely aware of its own scene of writing, that is absolutely scrupulous for accounting why a text comes into being. This actually is a pretty rare thing for a novel to do. Most of them just do not feel the need to explain how they become a document. But this is a novel that all the way through has explained why it has come into existence. We're aware of where it's being hidden at different times. I felt that you must have been thinking, why does a novel stop? Why would it end? So I spill out my little theory, but this is, to me, it's an interesting example of an impasse between, I feel entirely invested in my view of the text.
No, I know, and I think I'm just going to adopt your reason from now on and tell it to people. But no, because you've made me feel so inadequate about about my thoughts about why it ends. There aren't really any, it's just she's got her where she wants her. And
but it's no, I think perhaps we can pick this up later in Q&A and so forth. But
especially the couple in the class who hung out and fought the good fight and said, "Nah, she hasn't killed herself." They must be feeling very smug now.
I think so. They are. They laughed in my face. But but before we open things up, could we hear some of the work in progress?
Okay, I'm going to stand up to do this because see what this is like. Okay, I don't normally read things from works in progress because ideally I like to sit on something for about 10 years before making it public. So you have to forgive any roughness or infelicities. Very briefly, this novel begins in 1950. It's a first-person novel also at the moment. I've been saying that I've been going back between first and third, as I usually do. But right now it's in first. The narrator and main character of the piece is Margaret Browning, who is 20, and she works in a department store in Oxford Street, London. And she's recently met a young man called Alfred Sharp, also 20, who's of a different class from her. He's from a sort of upper middle class, bohemian, artistic family who live in Regent's Park. His father is Hector Sharp, a famous artist, and this piece begins as Margaret is arriving at the house. As we passed through the wrought iron front gate, I tripped on something hard, and when I looked down to identify the obstacle, I found that I had collided with the tortoise. "Oh, it's only Homer," Alfred said, leaning over to pat the creature. "We keep him in the garden, but he's a rather restless soul, I'm afraid, always trying to run away. Would you like to hold him? He's quite friendly." I thought that on balance I would rather not hold Homer. The idea of making physical contact with all that scale and shell and claw made me feel slightly sick. But I didn't want to appear ungracious, so I nodded gamely and took him anyway, clasping the animal in both hands and holding him well away from my body like a child bearing one of the royal gifts in a nativity play. I followed Alfred up the front steps. It was dark and cool in the Sharps' entry hall. As soon as the front door clicked shut, a woman's voice called out from above. "Inigo, is that you?" "No, it's Alfred," Alfred shouted back. "Bloody hell," the voice said. "Where's Inigo?" "Can't help you there." Alfred turned to me. That's my sister Estelle. I was peering at the oil paintings hung in higgledy-piggledy fashion on the reddish-brown walls. It was hard to tell in the aquarium gloom, but a good many of them seemed to be of naked women. My father's work, Alfred said, following my gaze. He pointed to a large, unframed canvas depicting several reclining nudes. Family portrait. Ah! I nodded vigorously to disguise my embarrassment. Do you mean... I paused, suddenly aware of a warm, wet sensation spreading across my hands. Oh, I said, looking down at Homer, and beyond him to a pool of liquid rapidly forming on the tiled floor. Oh, Alfred repeated. I ought to have warned you. He often does that when he's nervous. Alfred took Homer and directed me to a lavatory beneath the stairs, where I washed my hands with a rather grubby sliver of soap, and then, since there didn't seem to be a towel available, patted my hands dry on my skirt. When I emerged, 2 children, a boy and a girl, both about 10 years old, were waiting for me. They were very blonde and pale-skinned, and wore bright, slightly menacing smiles. "Hello," the girl said. "I'm Lucretia, and this is Romilly. We're twins, but not identical. Did Homer pee on you?" "Yes," I said. I was rather frightened of children. "He did. You must be Alfred's brother and sister. And you're Margaret." "Yes," I said, "I am." "Is it true that you work in a shop?" Romilly asked. I groped for the appropriate tone of forbearing adult amusement. "Yes, I do." "Oh, how blissful!" Lucretia cried. "We've never met someone who worked in a shop before. May we visit you one day?" "Oh, I don't know about that," I said, smiling. "They're rather strict about visitors." Lucretia looked downcast. "Oh, but we'd be frightfully well behaved, and we could help you sell things." Alfred appeared now, holding Homer. "I see you've met the Pests," he said. "Run along now, you two. I'm taking Margaret to meet Mummy." Undaunted, Romilly and Lucretia skipped along behind us as Alfred led me down a flight of stairs to the basement and out into the garden. I blinked in the sudden brightness. The garden was long and narrow, bordered on one side by a high stone wall and on the other by the Regent's Canal. Halfway down the lawn, a woman and a man were seated on deck chairs, drinking from tall glasses. "Darling," the woman called out as we made our way over. "Hello, Mummy," Alfred said, setting down Homer. "This is Margaret." "Margaret!" the woman cried, holding out her arms. "Margaret! Margaret!" I was unaccustomed to being greeted with such intensity. I was momentarily convinced that some catastrophe had occurred, but Mrs. Sharp only gazed at me in a dreamily appraising way and held out a hand to be shaken. "Dear Margaret, how lovely that you came." Okay, we move on a little bit now. She has an extremely stressful afternoon, in which she's made to play croquet, which she's never played before. And she meets the rather evil sister Estelle and an older brother who's called Inigo and the father Hector. And finally, after a very long time, lunch is served. And she's sat between Inigo, the older, handsome brother, and Felix, an elderly Polish artist. "I hear you were at Cambridge," I said to Inigo while we waited for Mrs. Sharp to dole out the poached chicken. "Yes, I came down last year. I'm working in the city now." What did you study at Cambridge?" "I read history, theoretically." There was a pause. Inigo did not seem unduly burdened by the need to keep the conversational ball in the air. "And what sort of work do you do in the city?" I inquired. Inigo cocked his head thoughtfully. "Do you know, I'm not really sure. It's to do with insurance, but I'm rather cloudy on the details. They keep trying to explain it to me, but my mind always seems to wander at the crucial moment." I was troubled by this. "But how do you do your work if you don't know what it is you're meant to be doing?" "Yes, you'd think it would be a bit of a problem, wouldn't you?" "It hasn't been so far. I expect they're breaking me in gently." I was about to press for further information when Mr. Sharp, seated at the head of the table, let out a bellow. "Good God," he said, pointing at Lucretia. "Why are you wearing that hideous colour?" Lucretia had changed for lunch and was now wearing a dirty-looking mustard-yellow blouse over her skirt. "It makes you look tubercular," Mr. Sharp went on. "Maud, how can you let her dress in such things?" Mrs. Sharp looked up from serving the chicken. "What? Oh dear, yes, that is a rather sick-making garment. Where's it from, Lucretia?" "I found it in the park." "The park? Rishi, what on earth—" "Go upstairs and change immediately," Mr. Sharp ordered. "I won't have such ugliness in my sight." "Daddy—" "At once." Lucretia got up and slouched over to the door. "I'm sorry, Margaret," Mrs. Sharp said. "I'm afraid we're rather obsessed with the way things look in this family." "Don't apologise," Mr. Sharp thundered from the top of the table. "The worship of beauty isn't something one apologises for."
He pointed at me. You agree, Mary, don't you? You don't think we should apologize for caring about what's beautiful? Margaret, Daddy, Estelle corrected him in a droll tone. Her name is Margaret. Margaret, Mr. Sharp said. Isn't that right? Well, I don't know, I said. My voice sounded reedy and weak. I was aware that I was blushing. I suppose an artist is bound to care more about beauty than most people. Quite, Estelle murmured from across the table. Her tone hovered ambiguously between thoughtful assent and mockery. I glanced at Alfred, wondering if I had said something very gauche, but he was gazing fixedly at his fork. What is Lucretia doing picking up clothes in the park anyway? Mrs. Sharp asked. I mean, really, has that thing even been washed? I found it by the pond, said Lucretia, who hadn't actually left the room but was lingering at the door, hoping for a reprieve. Romilly and I were looking at the ducks. Ducks, Mr. Sharp said. Why are you looking at ducks, you dreary children? Can't you find something more interesting to do? Ducks are quite interesting, actually, Romilly intervened. Rishi and I have been making a study of their fornication habits. Aha, Mr. Sharp said, beaming. What have you discovered? Well, Romilly said, they seem to have an awfully uncomfortable time of it. Mr. Sharp slapped his hand on the table like a pantomime king and shouted with laughter. Yes, Lucretia said, sensing a chance to redeem herself. Romilly says the lady ducks practically drown when they get fucked. Mr. Sharp stared at Lucretia with protruding eyes. Silence fell upon the lunch table. Mrs. Sharp, who seemed to be the only person not to have heard the offending remark, looked up from serving the chicken. What? Is something the matter? Revolting child, Mr. Sharp cried. Upstairs at once. Upstairs. What about my lunch? You can go without. A bit of starvation might improve your filthy manners. Oh, dear, did she say something dreadful? Maud asked as Lucretia scurried out the door. Conversation at the table turned now to a painting of Estelle that Felix, the old Polish man, had just completed. Estelle was unhappy with it, apparently. Do admit, Fee, you've made me look fat and cross, she said, and you've also given me the most monstrous chest. Please, darling, Mr. Sharp said, wincing. Don't say chest in that awful shopkeeper way. Say bosoms. Say breasts, but not chest. I won't tolerate it. Why do shopkeepers say chest? Romilly asked. I don't know, darling, Mrs. Sharp said. Margaret works in a shop, Romilly went on. Do you say chest, Margaret? Well, All right, Estelle interrupted. He's made my bosoms look horrid, like fried eggs. Yum, yum, Romilly said. Don't be disgusting, Romilly. I wasn't being disgusting. You mentioned fried eggs, and I was reminded of how much I enjoy eggs cooked that way. To my left, I could hear Felix speaking in low tones to Mr. Sharp on the subject of the female form. What is the term, he said, the areola. I must say, I've always found the areola is the most enchanting part of a woman's body. It's those delicious little bumps around the circumference. So this trying lunch comes to an end. One more page. And there are various other entertainments. And she's given a frightening trip. She's shown around the house by the crazy mother. And finally she leaves. Alfred walked me to the bus stop. It was odd to be out on the street alone with him again. We had hardly spoken to one another over the course of the afternoon. I glanced back at the house, which was lit up now and blazing in the darkness like a galleon on the sea. I wondered if Alfred was going to kiss me, and if so, how it was going to be managed. I had no great yearning to be kissed, but it would be better, I thought, not to have the thing looming over us. I watched his mouth as he spoke, trying to imagine what it would be like to have his lips on mine. Was it all right, then, he said, meeting them all. Oh, yes, I had a lovely time, I said. Your family is ever so lively. Too lively, some might say. That woman at lunch, the one with the strange eyes, like a cat's, who is she exactly? Sylvia, you mean? Oh, she's my father's mistress. My mouth fell open. But does your mother know? Oh, yes, she knows. And doesn't she mind awfully? I expect so. I was silent as I pondered this astonishing intelligence. After a moment I asked, does she come to the house often? Sylvia, I mean. No, not often. But can't your mother... Don't ask me to explain it, Alfred interrupted roughly. I felt that I had betrayed a vulgar curiosity. I'm sorry, I said. I didn't mean to pry. Oh, it's all right, Alfred said. I didn't mean to snap. We'd reached the bus stop now. Alfred made an odd sighing sound. Thank you for inviting me, I said. I had a lovely... I broke off as Alfred's face swooped down to mine. There was a sharp blow as our foreheads clashed, followed by a dry, glancing pressure on my lips. And then it was over. Alfred had kissed me. He straightened up briskly, patted me on the shoulder, and turned away to gaze down the road. "Oh, look, here's your bus," he said, with something that sounded very much like relief. Thank you.